All right, so today I got the legendary track coach Dan Pfaff again. So, coach, I'm just gonna because we already done this before. I'm just gonna ask like some questions. So the first topic I want to ask is about like the overall load management because nowadays everybody's talking about like this term of load management, and there's a lot of like ACL tear, there's like Achilles tendon tear, there's uh like Tommy John surgery, UCL injury. So can you kind of explain like your thoughts on like tendon loading for the off season to preseason and in season and overall like the load management?
I think load management is a very broad term, and I think there's a lot of layers to load management. Sport-specific activities, supportive activities, Life 101 activities. So, like financial stress or home stress can totally change the load of a workout on an athlete. An athlete might do that workout when everything's going well, and it's not a stressor, but combine that with stress from home, and all of a sudden it's overload. So I don't think there's a really good way to manage all these different layers and levels of load. On the tendon issue, it's my bias that yeah, there's good research and there's good theory behind various eccentric and isometric type work, for tendon development and enhancement and rehabilitation. But I think people are going down a rabbit hole where they're trying to use exercise without looking at all the co-contributors to the problem. So you could have a serious hardware problem where there's really bad pelvic movement or inhibition of movement in the pelvis or in the femur itself and how the femur is moving and rotating or the shank of the lower leg or the joints of the foot. And if you're strengthening uh, tendon areas with these joints really malfunctioning or in bad position, to me, you're kind of putting gas on the fire. So, I use eccentrics and isometrics? Yeah, but it's just, one piece of the puzzle. My first stop is to do a really good SWOT analysis on what's going on in the entire body from an tensegrity viewpoint. And in my experience, a lot of times these malfunctioning joint areas are the biggest driver for a lot of these tendon issues that we're seeing. I think a second thing that is probably overlooked uh, is we assume athletes, if they're at an elite level or an advanced level, know the ABCs of their sport. And in my experience, it's probably the law of thirds. So I'm continually amazed at when I take professional athletes through my change in direction screens and whatnot, no one's ever taught them the ABCs of decelerating or cutting or rotating. So unawareness of what to do with the center of mass, the pre-penultimate step, the penultimate step, the pivot step, where the torso should be during those moments. Uh, Curvilinear running, how the outside leg has unique tasks that it's doing, and the inside leg is like the rudder of the ship. And do they know how to manipulate and maneuver those segments? So I think part of the problem we have is we missed the boat on educating the ABCs or the fundamentals of the essentials of movement. So my first SWOT is to look at movement and see, based on my norms, my data sets, are they a standard deviation away from the norm, in these particular movements? And then if they are, my first stop is to explore hardware issues, these joint functions, these joint movements and whatnot. So one of the last things I worry about is programming in strength. Until I get an understanding of those variables, I'm a little bit hesitant to just indiscriminately use strength, under this idea that I can myopically improve a tendon area.
This is awesome because I think a few months ago, like Coach Boo, like one of my mentor, one of Adam Petway's mentor, Coach Boo, actually tweeted on like hamstring strain because like I know a lot of like coaches use Nordic hamstring curl as they think is a prevent probably an exercise that can prevent hamstring injury. But what Coach Wu actually said is like hamstring strain, Nordic hamstring curl is not gonna be the prevent like the cure for hamstring injury. It's about like the mobility in the hip, the knee, and the ankle.
Yeah, I think a lot of these correctives, like Copenhagen's or variations, Copenhagen's or Nordics and variations of Nordics. My first issue is the athlete's not moving through space. And this is a stationary exercise where there's no translation through space. It's generally a slow movement. In the case of Nordics, it's about one joint, where we know hamstrings are two joint muscles. So you already got a lot of gaps, by utilizing that. Nordics have been the rage probably for 20 years now in European circles. And I'm not seeing the data where, they're making a difference, to be honest. And I think there's a failure to ergonomically analyze when these injuries are occurring. So, at what speed are they occurring and what phase of gait are they occurring? So, we know a lot of bicep femoris injuries are about shank control, angular velocity of the shank, touchdown distance, yada, yada, yada. While the athlete's moving through space, while they're translating horizontally through space and vertically through contacts. So when you use a muscular exercise without using the elastic system, you're not really using what the athlete's going to use in the real world. So movement in sport is a harmony between elastic contributions and muscular contributions. And a lot of these corrective exercises are really muscular biased. The contribution of elastic energy or elastic stability is really reduced by those exercises. So that's another um, flaw, I think, in the reasoning or the logic there.
Nice, nice. So, uh, I probably need to correct. I probably need you to correct me if I'm understanding this wrong, but let's say if we talk about like those like tendinopathy that a lot of athletes have, if I'm understanding like all these concepts correct, if the athlete have like like let's say they have tendinopathy on their patellar tendon, so if they have internal rotation and external rotation on the knee that have pain, maybe we should check if their ankle mobility is fine, if their hip mobility is okay. If that's okay, then we should probably instead of like just doing isometric, we could probably do like let them just do acceleration or even like rudiment series. That's also gonna help with tendinopathy rehab. Am I correct?
Yeah, so most elastic activities are tendon enhancement activities. Uh, But that said, I mean, depending on the stage of the injury, isometrics, there's pretty good evidence about stress shielding and the initial remodeling of a tendon. So, I'm not against using these tools. It's just when do you use them, for how long do you use them, and then what else are you using? I think the danger we fall into is reductionism, where we say, well, if we do these five PT exercises and these three weight room exercises, we're going to be out of jail. And that's ignoring these hardware problems that are going on, Or maybe there's a bias through the sport or through their programming history that is causing them to use muscular systems in a way that's actually creating undue torque in these joint areas. So, for example, in the NFL, linemen do a lot of starts and short burst type running. So there's a bias to horizontal force application. There's a bias to how the muscular systems are developed in their body. And so then when they get up to run, if they ever have to get in that environment and they're upright, that upright demand is working against the biases that they've done billions and billions of reps upon. So I think that's, another variable. And I think also aligning with Boo on this it is how do we vaccinate the athlete? What's the type of change in direction work in curvilinear sprinting and linear sprinting and acceleration? What are those numbers like where we are developing tissue tolerance for the task and developing biochemical pathways and batteries to execute the task? So if we have poor biology and we have poor tissue tolerance, our injury numbers are going to go up.
Hmm. So, uh, since we talk about Copenhagen and Nordic hamstring curl, uh, Boo kind of mentioned that his thought on hamstring, but can we kind of share that what are the common cause for groin pain that we need some coaches need to do Copenhagen? They think they need they think they the athlete need to do Copenhagen, but that's not the cure like we mentioned.
Well, so my first question is how are people arriving at that there's a weakness? What testing or assessment protocols are they using to assess that this muscle group is below par or substandard, or there's some kind of gross asymmetry on one side of the body to the other. Um, all of those are assessment variables that you have to be running in your matrix. But again, I circle back, is pelvic function properly? Is the sacrum nutating and counter nutating? Is the ilium going out flare, in flare at the right moment? Are the vertebral segments moving and rotating in the way that they should? Because if they don't, then undue stress is going to pile up in a certain area. So in some sports that have a high incidence of adductor injuries, like ice hockey, part of that's the ergonomics of the sport. The foot and the leg is very externally rotated. They apply force laterally. So there's massive abduction and external rotation during the push-off phase. And that's putting, really undue stress through the adductors. Now combine that with an ilium on that side that's locked down and a sacrum that's not moving, and you're going to have an explosion in that area. I don't care how strong you get with Copenhagen's. If you got a hardware problem and you're in a sport where the ergonomics force you to have a lot of abduction and a lot of external rotation, I don't think Copenhagen's are going to save the day.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you on this one because I think a lot of like groin pain I deal with, I usually start with testing if they have scoliosis or not and then check their sacrum. And usually they will have some sort of sacrum pain or SI joint pain. And I don't mean that scoliosis is the cause. I feel like you mentioned, how they produce force, the foot is probably external rotated. That's probably the cause.
Yeah, I think so. Scoliosis is going to create an asymmetric to your movement. So you're going to find certain pathologies and injuries on one side of the body versus the other because the scoliosis has kind of shifted the axis of centering, if you will. So scoliosis athletes are always a unique puzzle, and that's why the technical model has to have some bandwidth to it. So if you got extreme scoliosis, you're going to have asymmetries, but our job is to figure out where is the guardrails and the boundaries on those asymmetries. Is one standard deviation violation okay? Yes, but is 1.5 increasing risk? That's what you determine by collecting data over time. I think
Nice.
another problem that I have with a lot of this testing is, if the muscle test gives you low output, people automatically assume it's weak. It might be fatigued because it's doing more work than it should in all phases of gait and during the day and standing or whatnot. So that muscle group or series of muscles may test inferior because it's fatigued. It's not necessarily weak, it's exhausted. Another thing to look at is neural inhibition. So if we have neural blockage, say you have prolapsed disc with nerve root inflammation, that can create a cascade down the sciatic nerve, down the femoral nerve, and the peripheral nerve systems. I mean, there some interesting studies where a few of the football clubs in Europe are doing prolotherapy on these prolapsed disc with athletes that have chronic hamstring tendinopathy, and they're having a lot of success with that prolotherapy. So what does that say? Well, that inflammation of the nerve root from the prolapsed disc area is creating a cascade of bad signaling down the sciatic nerve, and then the resultant nerve branches off of it, and it's creating a neuropathic environment, but it's being driven by this vertebral disc, not by the hamstring itself.
Nice. Nice. I like it. I like it. So, I want to jump outside like hamstring or like groin pain and kind of like go back a little bit like load management, but not load management. So there's a lot of like ACL or Achilles tendon tear going on recently on like all the sports right now. So can you kind of like share like your thoughts on like some ACL injury mechanics? I know Adam Petway, shout out to Adam, he did a like great research on this, but can you kind of like share like what are like the common like injury mechanics you see in ACL?
Yeah. So probably the two most common injuries that come across my desk, with field court are Achilles and ACL, or close might be patella tendon. So what we see in ACLs generally, whether it's contact or non-contact, it's early engagement, mid-engagement, or late engagement. You got to discern all of that. Is it non-contact? Is it contact? And when in the contact phase is it occurring or whatnot? So some of the things that we note is the torso is in retroversion. The athlete doesn't fold down before they try to pivot or cut. So the torso is in a real bad place. And they step laterally with it. And they don't have much of a pre-penultimate step or a penultimate step. They put all their money into that pivot step. So you got a lateral step with a lot of force on it, with the torso in a bad position, and then you go to rotate and boom. So we see that scenario over and over. I probably got 90 videos on my hard drive of the moment where it goes. On Achilles, what we see is the angular velocity of the shin rolling forward, that shin roll. So the angular velocity of that and the lack of an isometric stop point, so they blow through that stop point. And so the Achilles goes when the shin is closing down, it's rolling down, and that velocity is increasing and it misses that stop point and boom. And again, we got dozens and dozens of videos where if you measure the angular velocity of the shank and you look for that stoppage endpoint that doesn't occur, that isometric stoppage wall doesn't occur, they blow through it, that's when it goes. So I think in the ACL world, some of it is programming and design and bias training and whatnot, but a lot of it is kids are not being taught how to change direction. And on the Achilles situation, I think a lot of this is fatigue driven and probably I think we're kind of our worst enemy. We're doing a lot of positive lower leg work. In other words, going up, concentrically or even isometrically up. We're not doing an equal amount of yielding and we're not alternating foot axis positions and velocities and loads and things of that. So I think we're biasing the activity of the gastroc, the soleus, the plantaris, and the intrinsic extrinsic foot muscles into a positive concentric bias, if you will, and it's not being counterbalanced by what I call a negative or eccentric or yielding platform of activities. So I had an interesting experiment that I did this summer with three NBA big guys. Uh, they're either centers or big forwards. And two of them were chronic ankle injury kind of guys, and that's how I got involved. They wanted to try to get better, weathering all these ankle injuries. And the third guy was a patella tendon rupture guy uh, coming back. So we put him on a platform on a Smith machine, and they had to do a 5 second eccentric negative toe rise. So they went from parallel, foot axis parallel, 5 second eccentrically down. And I asked them to do 5 reps. Well, none of the three could do 5 reps. And there was asymmetry, like one side would drop really bad, the other side they had control over. I mean, there was a lot of dysfunction, and that was with the foot axis straight ahead. When I turned them internal foot axis, they failed even earlier. If I turned them out external, they have better success. So that told me that the foot axis positioning on these eccentric and isometric exercises are a big variable. My second test was isometric hold. So those same 3 foot positions, I wanted them to eccentrically go down as far as they could and hold for 60 seconds. And I asked them to do it 3 times. One guy could do it once, the other two couldn't even do it once. And these guys are big name, highly paid NBA guys. So there's something we're missing there. Now, all three claim to have done a lot of positive toe riser work in their past, but none of the three had ever explored the negative. None of the three have ever played with foot axis angles. So tibial rotation is a big variable in Achilles injury. So it's not only the angular velocity of the shin rolling, but it's also the amount of tibial rotation during that movement. And so if you don't challenge various foot axis angles, then you're not really building a versatile anti-tibial rotation or tibial control mechanism in my mind.
So typically what like would you like put these exercises into like circuit training
Yeah.
and would probably attack that like every week?
Yeah, depending on their injury history or whatnot. Anybody that's got lower leg injuries or foot injuries, it's kind of mandated we do it 2 to 3 times a week. Um, People that are relatively healthy will microdose it maybe once a week.
Nice, nice. So we talk about like ACL, we talk about Achilles tendon injury. How about UCL injury that happens a lot in Major League Baseball?
Yeah. Well, it's probably a really complex puzzle. There's been a big push for load management in baseball, as you know. So, like, I work with a young man. He was in low A this year, and they limited him to no more than 4 innings and 85 pitches or whatnot. Where in high school, he was throwing 7 or 8 innings and, probably throwing 150 pitches. So they really reduced his workload. So, I thought that we needed to stay where he's used to working. So on the days that he wasn't pitching, he had to go out and do some work. So I think we've gotten so conservative on these guys that maybe tissue tolerance has been reduced, perhaps. One of the things that we look at a lot is the pronation of the humerus in the forearm and the hand during release and delivery. And we see people that overpronate the humerus but underpronate the forearm and hand have a higher incidence of injuries in the elbow region. So some of this might be mechanics, some of this might be tissue tolerance. We're so conservative with the loading that we're not really vaccinating these guys. Another wild card is a lot of guys are throwing variable weight balls, and their schemes are all over the shop. So, how much do you throw at a certain weight? When do you throw it? What day of the week do you throw it? How do you follow it up? What's the fatigue like? How are the mechanics altered when you're doing that? So you could be throwing a lot of heavies this time of the year, and you're going to evolve into certain compensations and positions in order to hit that number. The danger of that then is when you freshen up and start throwing the regular ball, maybe you're stuck into those positions that you were using in a fatigue state with the heavy ball. So I think there's probably a lack of assessment or monitoring of these guys. Everybody's looking at velocity, but not a lot of people are looking at segmental movements and positions. So they're looking at spin rate and velocities and things of that nature, but probably less of an emphasis on segmental positionings, the angular velocity of these segments, the cooperation, the synchronization of these segments. Some pitches create unique movements to these segments. And so those movements when you're fresh probably aren't real threatening, but when you're tired, those movements may become the enemy. So I think there's probably a lack of research too on what types of pitches are these guys throwing when they're in a fatigue state. And then, we can't get around, we're developing stronger, more powerful guys. And like everybody throws 90 now, where 10 years ago that there were a handful. And so, are we slowly approaching kind of a ceiling with our methodology right now where, at 102, 103 miles per hour is that kind of the ceiling until we evolve some of our programming and our therapy and our rehab and our recovery. So I would say right now, with the guys I have on my board, 101, 102 is kind of our ceiling until we figure this out a little bit better.
Nice, nice. I like it. I like it. Uh, so that's like the injury mechanics for ACL, Achilles tendon, and UCL. So, uh, I know we kind of talked about this before, the return to play process, but can you kind of share like return to play from ACL and how, like until like w what kind of benchmark you see you start implementing like a little bit like plyo? Like when are you start like gonna load them? And probably the same question with Achilles tendon.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit different on that. I I'm not a fan of bracing or casting or resting. So I'll say that right away because remodeling is going to occur the minute the injury has happened. And what we put through that area during all stages of that remodeling process is going to influence the quality of the remodeling, the type of the remodeling, etc. So I believe as early as possible, I want to do things that vary velocities and forces and angles of insult and duration of insult and come up with patterns on how often to do something. Is it every day, is it every 2 days or whatnot? So those are balls that I'm constantly juggling, but plan B for me is plan A. So I would say, okay, what this time of the year, if this athlete wasn't injured, what would they be doing? And then I try to make that kind of the baseline of what we're going to do in plan B. So, I got a baseball guy coming off hip surgery. So, a few weeks, as soon as he got clearance from his surgeon, he was throwing sitting in a chair. He's throwing off one knee. He was throwing various weights at various velocities. We were controlling the mechanics to make sure he wasn't compensated or whatnot. But because this time of the year, he's throwing a lot for his cardiopulmonary and CNS and all of that, we use battle ropes and bike workouts, single leg bike workouts because he'd had a hip labral surgery with cartilage intervention, hand crank workouts on a hand ergonomic device. Weightlifting, we lifted like, it was December and January. If he was healthy, we just did all the lifts single legged, so single leg clean, snatch, single leg X bar deadlifts. We couldn't do step ups, obviously, so we had to come up with some alternatives there, various leg press things. So when I get to a menu item that they normally do that's risky, then I got to get creative. What can we do with that menu item that mimics or is in the postcode of that activity? Because otherwise, you're disrupting a long-standing training process of this athlete. And I think that's where we get in a lot of trouble with rehab is these kids have been training on the roll for 3 or 4 years, and then for 8 weeks, we're going to take them totally away from training and put them in a pool or give them rubber band exercises, and everything detrains. So my first thought is, okay, we got to keep biochemistry amped up. We got to keep the central nervous system amped up. So we're using complex units and we're doing everything we can, to increase CNS stress. Are we doing more things than we would if this guy was able to pitch? Yeah, but not too far away from what his normal day looks like. And I think that's the mistake a lot of people make. Timelines are important, but those timelines are averages on average people. And I'm working with really above average people with very unique genetics. This pitcher that I'm working with, surgeon was renowned. He's one of the world's best. They use stem cells, they use PRP, they use all kinds of stuff. This guy had electrical stim on his hip like 2 hours after the operation. I mean, these guys are top shelf. So, timeline for this cat's going to be different than the 50-year-old neighbor that fell down the steps that needs hip surgery. So I've always kind of worked on a mastery idea. It's like, okay, we're going to do this real basic movement and you're going to do it really well. And if there's no pain or swelling or gross body compensations, you've mastered that level of movement. We're going to increase the difficulty of that movement. So like, our dribble series. So with once that wound is healed, we put him in the pool neck deep. It's cold here in Texas right now, so he was in a wetsuit and he did walking over the ankle exercises for a few weeks, and then the couple more weeks ankle dribbling over the calf walking. And so he went through the walking progressions and the shapes at concentric and elliptical, and then no problem. So then we started a little bit of a bounce in the water, so kind of a jogging speed on these activities. So it's kind of can you do it? Are there no negative results? You've mastered it. Let's move to the next degree of difficulty. So that's an underarching principle for us is plan B as close to plan A as possible, and mastery of these progressions is what's going to dictate whether you move forward.
Mm.
And then also we know that sometimes there's regression, and this is a trap a lot of people get to into in RTP is they think progression is linear. And a lot of times it's two steps forward, one back. So this guy had days where walking over the calf, he was really efficient, no compensation. And there are other days where he was wobbly and the shapes weren't very good. And so we went back to walk over the ankle. His brain needed to recover, or maybe he slept wrong or something, but we weren't going to put gas on the fire, having him stay on this progression line when the movement was faulty. So I think there's a lack of assessment of movement quality in a lot of these return to play activities. So we give them this list and they do it and it's ticked boxes, but there's no monitoring or feedback or accountability on the quality of the movement. So like, if I got an athlete with a disc problem, I'll give them a few Eldoa exercises to do, but I make sure I walk them through it. I teach the ABCs. I teach them mantras to say to themselves, okay, my hands are here. I'm stretching my hands, my chin's pulled back. So they got things they're doing. And then I have them video when they're at home, and a lot of times it's not even close. So I know that they're not ready for homework. So I'm going to monitor it and hold them accountable and teach until I know they really got it. And so there's a process into giving athletes homework or relying on athletes to do the rehab exercises. Like I've got friends that are ATCs at major Division I schools, and one of my colleagues, he has 120 kids on a track team. So, and he's got like two grad student assistants and a couple undergrad assistants. And how are you going to monitor rehab and prehab and with those kind of numbers? So, I realize some of these environments, it's really difficult, but quality of movement matters in return to play. And I think the sloppier people are with movements in the return to play process, I think it handicaps or restricts that process and probably has a negative effect on the remodeling of the structures, tissues that were damaged.
Nice, nice. I like it. I like it. So, uh, I kind of want to ask this because you mentioned like if it's a lower limb injury, you probably start with the pole or start in the water. Why start in the water instead of like just maybe start at the track?
Well, the water offloads, so we'll go neck deep because that really offloads the structures. And then no problem, then we go chest deep. No problem, then we go waist deep. Then no problem, we go thigh deep. No problem, then we segue to land. So it's kind of a process.
So usually in your experience, like how long does like this from neck deep to like just go to land? Like how long is this process gonna take?
It depends on the injury, severity of the injury, the athlete's willingness to, stay focused and do movements correctly. Because I'm accountability nut, I'm like, these movements aren't good, we're not progressing, so they know that going in. So timeline, it's is super variable. What's their age? How severe was the injury? Did they have surgery or not? Is this a reoccurrence injury? So injuries that keep reoccurring kind of change that process a little bit versus a one-off injury. So I've got a girl, chronic ankle sprain. She's a sprinter for me. She played soccer through middle school and early high school, and just dozens of ankle sprains on both ankles. So we're spending a lot of time developing ankle integrity and things of that nature. Because it's chronic, we end up going really slow in these progressions. Another athlete rolled the ankle just getting out of their car. It was one time only. And we could move that person a lot faster because the brain didn't have all the storage of trauma and compensation patterns, that have developed over dozens of ankle sprains. So I think that's a variable that therapists sometimes overlook is this a chronic injury or is this an acute injury? Because the progressions and the timelines are going to vary, in my experience, going to vary quite a bit between an acute and a chronic.
Nice, nice. Cool, cool. So, kind of want to like go back a little bit because you mentioned like the ABCs for everything. And for ACO, I think you kind of mentioned the ABC for like change direction. So, when it comes to like change direction, correct me if I'm wrong. So, the ABC is like entry velocity, like how entry velocity, middle chunk lean, and penultimate, and the change direction. Like, am I correct?
Yeah, so when people decelerate or they cut, some heuristics is they lower the center of mass uniformly. It's not all at once. So there's a uniform lowering of the center of mass. There's a uniform folding of the torso a little bit. The pre-penultimate step, touchdown distance, is a little bit in front of the center mass, the penultimate a little bit more, and the pit step the most. So are they doing those ABCs really well? And then if it's three-dimensional, so if you're looking from behind, okay, maybe they're doing it okay, but they're really stepping lateral with the penultimate step or the pre-penultimate step. Well, that's going to change your vectoring. So I think the assessment has to be done from multiple perspectives, but those heuristics are pretty solid heuristics. Damian Harper, a good colleague and friend, tons of really good information on his blog and his webpage, for people that are really interested in change in direction and deceleration. He's kind of my go-to expert.
Nice, nice, nice. So, the last topic I want to ask you is, uh, usually when it comes like training sprinters, like usually or like jumpers, how would you match the weight room quality with, uh, the track session? If like, let's say if it's a sprinter, if we're doing like acceleration today, like, would you do like what would you do like max strength, like power clean, or and when it comes to like max velocity, would you pair with uh ballistic or like short range of motion type of lift?
Yeah. So first things first, to me, the weight room is an adjunct activity to sprinting. So it should add value. Shouldn't drive the program. And it shouldn't drastically interfere with the programming. So on a KPI scale, if I'm hierarchically ranking, block starts and excels and upright sprints and special speed endurance, and those are higher KPIs than the weight room. The weight room is about a third generation activity for me. So that said, I think any menu item that you have in the weight room, you should have a bunch of answers for why you're doing it. And I think you've also got to assess the athlete that's in front of you. So if I've got a thoroughbred or a greyhound, and I put a lot of absolute strength challenges on that athlete, I'm probably going to make him worse. If I've got a plow horse and I do a bunch of speed strength exercises, that's probably not going to help that guy or that gal very much. So determining the type of exercise and how it's done and when it's done is, part of the art of coaching. Time of year, stage of development. So I've had sprinters under 10 seconds that never lifted weights. Like Carl Lewis never lifted until he was like 33 years old, and he did it because of injuries. And he ran really fast and was really healthy and had a lot of years at the top. We got to remember weightlifting in sprinting really wasn't a thing until in the US until the late 80s. And that's, the influence of drugs and East European programming and things like that. So I could take an exercise like, say, a real heavy deadlift or a heavy squat. And ergonomically, what am I doing with that exercise? I'm probably increasing the number of motor units that are being recruited, probably affecting the magnitude of firing of those motor units, and so on and so forth. So that's going to help the first few steps during acceleration, but it's not going to add a ton of value when I'm upright, where there's a higher vertical demand. And the window for those executions are very small, where we got to rely more on elastic energy to help us produce the necessary forces rather than muscular. So that's what I mean about bias training. So if I've done a lot of absolute strength training with this person, I probably have helped their initial acceleration, but I may have killed them at top end, and I may have really killed them about speed endurance. So that's kind of the art of coaching is like, why are you going to do this? What is it going to affect? And then I always do the worst case scenario. Okay, how could this negatively affect what we're doing?
Hmm.
So it's called inverted thinking. So I think good military strategists always do worst case scenarios. Well, what about this? Or if this happens, or what if they do this or whatnot? So I do a lot of inverted thinking analysis. When I write programming, I'm like, okay, I'm going to put this in, and I think it's going to be positive. It's going to do this, this, and this because of that, that, and that. And then I got to take that hat off and do the inverted hat and say, okay, what could be the downside of this? So say I have a big absolute strength block with a sprinter, and they're a greyhound, very elastic driven, and they gain 3 or 4 kilos from that block. That's probably a negative for a greyhound. It's probably going to restrict their range of movement of certain body segments. That's probably a negative for a greyhound. It's probably going to increase my contact time on the ground because I'm biased to using muscular output and control. So now I've increased contact time, reduced range of motion. Those are not big wins. So, long story short, I don't think there's a bad exercise necessarily out there. It's just why are you doing it? When are you going to do it? At what stage of development do you do it? What kind of loading are you doing with it? But the big sweep is step back and realize this is a third generational activity. Is it negatively affecting the first or second generational KPIs that you're working on?
Hmm.
So in American football, we went down the bigger, stronger rabbit hole for decades. And a lot of teams are still in that rabbit hole.
Yeah, cool. So, Coach, I guess my last question before I let you go is when it comes to like sprinter, indoor season is mainly like 60 meters, outdoor would probably go to like 100. So, how would you program like your speed endurance? Like, does indoor season really need speed endurance? And how do you program it during outdoor?
Yeah. Well, it's my bias. I always looked at indoors as a midterm exam. So we used it to assess how we were doing on our starts, our excursion angle from the blocks, our acceleration curve, our transition abilities, and our upright sprinting. I would assess those variables. And so it was a midterm on part of the 100-meter race. So we didn't have a different strategy for how to run it. We ran the 60 like they were going to run 100. And the indoor just allowed us to measure and manipulate and play around with variables on 60 meters of a 100-meter race. So we didn't sell the farm and try to create a really fast 60. It was just a midterm for us. So that's where I may differ from a lot of people. That said, I'm a concurrent training guy and I don't have a lot of variation in my programming throughout the year. So long speed endurance, special speed endurance, alactic, those are variables that I'm going to train all year long, every cycle, no matter what's going on. Because I made that mistake with a few guys that were indoor specialists, and it just took us months to get back in those qualities because we left them alone during indoor. And after you slam your hand in the car door a couple of times, you're like, this is dumb. Like, I'm not going to do it anymore.
Nice, nice. Think, man, that answered all the questions I have today, and it's like really good. Appreciate you, coach.
Yeah, not a problem. I enjoy it.